Prophecy?
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 Prophecy? Prophecy caused all this trouble.
That prophecy?
Yes!
Greetings. Last October, Berean TV hosted a debate between Vocab Malone and Dante on the subject of the American 400-year prophecy, or as I like to call it, the Amerocentric or even US-centric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy, which is to say the belief that Genesis 15 verses 13 and 14 are referring to the African diaspora in the Americas. And with all due respect to Dante, much of his position remained unclear in that debate. You know, the finer details remained obscure. He often alluded to things, you know, that others believed without clarifying to what extent he may or may not have agreed with them. And he touched on a variety of subjects that didn't seem terribly relevant to the topic. And at one point, even he seemed to remark that the presentation hadn't yet gotten to the subject of the debate, the actual subject.
And I know I'm not getting to the 400 years as quickly as you guys want to.
All we want is that prophecy.
What's interesting about Dante's approach is that he feels the proper understanding of the 400-year prophecy relates directly to his attempts to identify who the Israelites are. But it seems that there's a disconnect, however, insofar that his attempts to identify Israel wind up applying generally to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade and their descendants, which are spread across the Western Hemisphere. Yet his interpretation of the prophecy, on the other hand, winds up more narrowly being limited to the scope of the United States.
A prophecy that misread could have been.
This becomes clear when one notes that he begins the count of the 400 years in specifically the year 1619.
According to you, not everybody else, just Dante Fortson, when did the 400 years begin according to you?
I agree with Dr. Eric Mason that it began in 1619 when the first African slaves arrived in Jamestown. I agree with Dr. Mason on that.
The reason why starting the count at that year is problematic is because the transatlantic slave trade did not begin in 1619. For example, for an easy example, slaves were brought from Africa to what is now Brazil in the earliest years of the 1500s. And, you know, there's honestly a certain incongruence in connecting the prophecy to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade on the one hand, and then disregarding the entire first century of that slave trade on the other. If one wishes to more artificially limit the scope of the prophecy to just the United States, the objection still remains, as even the beginning of bringing slaves to the landmass that we now call the United States did not begin in 1619. You know, I realize that it's popular to throw that year around, but it is very much an artificial start to the count, as slaves were brought to this land, to the the land that's now called the United States, in the early 1500s as well. And this has been pointed out to Dante. Permit me to share a few examples. A little over a week ago, Dante posted, to Facebook on a theme which he's touched on several times, where he takes some online news story he came across and shares it as yet more evidence that America is currently in the judgment period, which is to come after the 400 years. So I offered a comment sharing what I just mentioned, that neither the transatlantic slave trade nor the bringing of slaves to the landmass now called the United States began in 1619. Rather, both began in the early 1500s. Then I noted that, hypothetically speaking, if one started the count in the early 1500s, one living in the early 1900s could have similarly cited the Great Depression as among the arbitrary signs of judgment. And I'll add now that, depending on where precisely one starts to count, one might have conceivably also included anything from the Spanish flu pandemic to the Dust Bowl to either of the first two world wars, maybe even the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this raises a question. How did Dante respond to that objection? Well, rather than attempt to address the central chronological issue, he merely attempted to change the subject, replying with the following, quote, "How about you focus on disproving that churches claim that there's language on those pews, since you said there is none, and so far we've seen people say Ge'ez, cursive Hebrew, and Arabic. Either disprove all of it or take the L," end quote. By the way, a quick side note, I may indeed make more videos on the subject of the pews, and, if I do so, and one wonders aloud why I'm quote-unquote beating a dead horse, I may note that, no less a person than Dante Fortson encouraged me to return to the subject of the pews. But putting that aside and getting back to the subject of this video, I want to make a quick comment on the practice of this practice of reaching for popular stories on the internet in a seemingly arbitrary fashion. In Dante's debate with Vocab, he ran through a number of things along those lines, a number of things that he felt pointed to the post-400-year judgment. And in perhaps the most glaring example of how such reflected his social media experience, he even he even brought up, quote-unquote, murder hornets.
He wants you to believe the murder hornets were coincidence.
Returning to Facebook, a couple days later, another gentleman posted some similar objections to the US-centric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy, and Dante was invited to comment. Once again, he did not address the central objection. Instead, he noted that others, including government agencies, have put emphasis on 1619. However, that doesn't escape the fact that such a starting point remains artificial. It's not the actual start for either the transatlantic slave trade or even slavery in the land now called the United States. Citing 1619 may be popular, but it's still artificial. In still another Facebook post, another gentleman who is apparently a proponent of this interpretation of the prophecy made the same sort of appeal to governmental, affirmation of the significance of the year 1619, though in this case he was citing something that was, at the state level, for specifically Virginia. But whatever the case, in the comments section, Dante claimed that skeptics of his interpretation of the prophecy are quote-unquote silent. So I attempted to again remind him of the objection, which he's seemingly not yet addressed. And how did Dante respond this time? Well, in keeping with a now familiar pattern, he once again tried to change the subject, replying as follows, quote, "It's been pointed out that you worship Mary and other dead people. Don't tell me shit about black history, especially when the convo is clearly way above your head. You need to worry about debunking there being Arab on those pews," end quote. I'm not sure what to say at this point. I mean, honestly, it's I really am honestly not sure what to say, except that it seems that Dante is unwilling to meaningfully grapple with the objections presented to his position. And I'll add that these sorts of responses are frankly, they're in keeping with a trend which was covered in a previous video of mine from a few months ago titled Just Ask Dante. Now, before I close this video, it's worth noting that Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s new book, The Black Church, has a passage which is relevant to this topic, and thus which I'd like to read here. Gates writes the following, quote, "We tend to forget that the first enslaved Africans actually arrived in North America long before the much-celebrated 1619 arrival of the 20 and odd Negroes from the Kingdom of Ndongo in modern Angola at Port Comfort on Hampton Roads at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Enslaved Africans had been living in the Spanish colony of Florida at least since 1526, when they were taken as laborers to the failed Spanish colony of San Miguel del Hualdape, near Sapelo Island, off the coast of Georgia. Other enslaved Africans followed in 1528, 1539, and 1565, when the first Africans arrived at St. Augustine." End quote. In short, it doesn't matter how popular it is to invoke 1619. That year still does not mark the actual start to slavery in the land now called the United States. If one is going to apply the 400-year prophecy to slavery in this land that's now called the United States, they should start the count in the early 1500s. But that would then have the end come in the early 1900s. And it's interesting that proponents of the Amerocentric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy tacitly acknowledge that the end of the 400 years coming in the early 1900s would be problematic, So now, regarding these various adjustments, like saying it's not referring to slavery in the Western Hemisphere, but rather only slavery in the United States, or maybe only part of the United States, or maybe only the United States under the rule of English speakers, etc. All of that comes off as ad hoc limitations to avoid the obvious chronological problems with the interpretation.
So it looks like in this case, what we're doing is that we're cutting the foot to fit the shoe.
And this raises another question. And this is the question I'll close it out with. Is the Amerocentric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy falsifiable? In other words, is there any meaningful, reasonable condition under which proponents will concede that their interpretation was mistaken? How many years have to pass before they conclude they were wrong? Maybe another 5 years, maybe more? Will they ever tell us this? Or will they never share that detail with us and prefer instead to keep the concept perpetually vague so as to more easily readjust it at times, as the years move on farther and farther away from 2019? Food for thought. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.
But y'all came on my channel with a 400-year false prophecy. The 400-year prophecy is nonsense. Dante ain't give faithful vocab that work with that 400-year prophecy. This is what it is. Listen, I'm going to tell y'all, if y'all know history, y'all reading the book wrong. I ain't saying y'all wrong in everything, but y'all wrong with that 400-year prophecy. This is just what it is. Tell us when the 400 years is supposed to begin. Y'all ain't articulating nothing. Y'all reading.